Hey everyone, this is TenderLovingCares,
And this is PizzaWolf.
and you're listening to the very first episode of
HORNGRY for More. It's a podcast about feedism by the community.
And for the Community.
I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. Yeah, 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 I'm hungry.
So here we go, the very first episode. How do you feel about it?
I guess you could say I'm nervously anticipating it. I don't know, excited, but awkward.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah,
It's a podcast. A million people have them. I'm sure it'll be fine.
we'll do it. So I thought for the beginning we could just make like a quick summary of who we are.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Patrick, but everyone in the feedism community probably knows me as PizzaWolf. I'm 32 years old. I'm pretty much an all-around feedist at this point. Feeder, feedy, big, handsome man, I guess you could say, fat admirer, just all over the place. I've contributed to the print version, well, the digital version of HORNGRY for each of the last episodes, the last two episodes, or issues, I suppose. And I'm studying law, going to be a lawyer from the southern part of the United States, Florida. That's me in a nutshell.
I'm Gabriella. I think most people know me as TLC or Tender Loving Cares. I'm 25. I mostly identify as like a female feeder or feederess, however you want to call it. But by definition, I'm also a fat admirer or like female fat admirer, I guess. And yes, you've mentioned I published a web magazine, Hungry, the printed version of this, the community magazine for those who don't know about big guys and the women who love them. I studied criminal psychology, and that's me. So this very first episode is kind of meant as a little bit more of an introductory episode, I guess. And
Mhm.
since we're starting this podcast later on, we totally want to have guests on the show and talk about all kinds of issues. For this very first one, we thought we'll just keep it to the two of us so people can kind of find out what they're actually getting into. And first of all, like, what will this podcast even be about? And our idea was to have something about more like fetishism in general. So, as you've said, you cover pretty much all the labels out there, while I
Mhm.
and like the printed issue of Hungry has been more about the BHM FFA fetishism part of it. I think most people already know what fetishism is, but we'll like go into some description later on. But just for now, be warned, this podcast will be kinky as shit. And that's how we like it. And of course, fat admiration is a big part of fetishism too, but since we're both fetists, this will be our main focus.
Yeah, and just as a legal disclaimer, this podcast is 100% intended only for the ears of listeners who are 18 and older. So if you're a kid, wait until you're an adult. I know it's tempting, but you could get everything shut down. So knock it off. It's 100% not safe for work. We're not going to believe ourselves. We're not
Mm-hmm.
going to swear all the time, but
Yeah.
just be forewarned. Fat kink stuff ahead.
It should actually be a sign for that. I'll totally put it outside my apartment, I think. Well, maybe outside my door.
Yeah, yeah, maybe not all the way outside the apartment.
No, that would be one weird sign. So yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to keep the general audience of this podcast to include everyone within the kink community,
Mm-hmm.
but not specifically focus on one aspect of it. So while the digital version of HORNGRY focuses primarily on female feeders and male feedees, this podcast itself is going to be a little bit more broad based. It's certainly not going to conform to any sexual orientation or gender binary
Yeah.
or anything. You know, if you're a person and you like chubby people, or you want to be a chubby person, or whatever it is, there's room for you here, and hopefully we'll be discussing topics which, grab your interest.
Yeah. And I hope this is going to be good news for everyone, but we're planning for this podcast to be a lot more frequent than the actually magazine. We're planning for one episode a month that hopefully, if everything works out, should be out always at the beginning of each month. And that's our plan for now. Like, whatever we go from there, we'll see, but that's the idea for now.
Yeah, and of course, if anyone wants to start a petition to get us to stop doing this podcast, I think if you reach 10,000 signatures, we'll knock it off. But until then, we're going to keep making them. And if you like them or have any suggestions, you can obviously like and subscribe in the YouTube and leave comments with suggestions. We'll try and incorporate some of those if they're good into further podcasts.
Definitely, yeah. So, you want me to start off with a question for you?
Yeah, ladies first. Why not?
Okay. So this is always like we've had on Fambrosia, for those people who know the website, that's mainly for chubby guys and the women who love them. We had this amazing topic in the forums about the origin stories. So what actually got you started out as a feedist? And I know we talked about this a bunch of times, but there's like always this one weird or funny moment in our childhood that we thought was completely normal or innocent at the time. But then we now kind of look back and we just know it was the first time we showed interest in the kink. And I mean, there's a reason we still remember it up to this day. So what was yours?
Yeah. Well, I'm sadly conforming to the stereotype where, things like those cartoons where one character gets really, really fat, or Willy Wonka or any of that stuff. I thought I just really, really liked these cartoons. I was like, Willy Wonka, that's a great movie. And it is a great movie. The Gene Wilder version certainly holds up after
Yeah,
years.
definitely.
But just the not only the classic Violet Beauregard scene where a girl turns into a blueberry, but also the Augustus Gloop scene with the chubby German boy in the River of Chocolate.
Yeah.
It kind of speaks to several aspects of the kink community. Who knows if Roald Dahl had some things going on? I don't, and then maybe that's probably projecting. But I think it's a very interesting kink to kind of approach, because dealing with food and fat, which are sort of large issues within culture in general, it's not the type of thing that you only come across after deep Googling on the internet, or finding like in the back bin of some seedy adult bookstore or something. No, it's something that if you're wired to eroticize it, you usually come across it fairly early in life, which is certainly what the case was for me.
Yeah, definitely.
What's your crazy origin story?
Actually, I have this weird theory about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because I've actually never really saw it as a kink thing. I don't think I've even seen it when I was a kid until like way later on, and now I find that there's like so many people who are into it. I'm really interested by that, because I do think that publications like that can maybe guide like whole generations into a certain version of the kink sometimes. Like, for example, there might be a later generation, one that's younger than me, who grew up maybe seeing the Johnny Depp version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Might be different, but I do think that, I don't know if anyone has seen an amazing documentary by Vice on the fetish business around the whole quicksand thing. I don't know if you've ever heard about it.
Haven't seen it.
There's this whole like community that fetishizes all those quicksand scenes that were in a lot of older movies that by now are more like just this cliche fun thing that sometimes happens in cartoons.
Plot device, yeah, sure.
Oh god, was it? Damn it, I forget the name of the movie. I should have looked it up. But they were
super well prepared here on the Horngry for More podcast.
I should have looked into every single kink there is before I started this.
How dare you?
No, there are actually some movies where it was first treated as something very seriously, and people who grew up around that age and have kind of fetishized it, they actually go into the documentary how that is a kink that seems to be kind of dying out to some extent, because it's not in movies anymore, at least not in a actually serious way. So I've always wondered how having different children adaptations where fat is an actual big component of it will kind of change how future generations will actually grow up with the kink, and maybe like the different way they will prefer certain aspects over other ones when it comes to the actual all the aspects we have within this kink.
That could be the case. The Gene Wilder version was 1971, which predates most of the active members within the kink community. I already feel like I'm 1,000 years old whenever I log on to any one of the websites, and that it certainly predated me in terms of its theatrical release. I think cartoons in general, although cartoons as a medium are kind of also changing, cartoons changing weights recur, I mean, thematically, relatively frequently in various cartoon media. Someone eats a magical cupcake, or they
Mm-hmm.
get cursed by a witch, or something happens, and it's an excuse to change the way. And I mean, we have versions of this dating back in print media to Superman comics where Superman gets fat, or Lois Lane. I mean, I guess
Really?
it's just a very, yeah, certainly.
Oh wow, I have to look this up.
Yeah, I guess maybe we'll put links in the description to some of this stuff. We can find it later. Maybe not. If not, don't hold it against me, podcast listeners or listener, whoever listens.
If it turns out that was all in his head, then I'm gonna.
No, no, no,
No.
no. I promise you it exists. But yeah, nevertheless, it's an interesting theory that kind of whatever the cultural representation is drives sort of the development of kink to some extent. I mean, I suppose that's kind of in line with just the idea that culture drives beauty standards
Mm-hmm.
generally, and this being kind of a more super specialized, hyper intense version of that. But
Yeah,
it's
basically beauty
it's
standards on
it's
steroids.
yeah, it's good to know, and it's certainly I'm sure that's going to resonate with a lot of people in the community that we were all there in one degree or another as younger people seeing these depictions and not being quite sure how we were processing them.
Yeah, so for me, it kind of was similar. I do remember some cartoons, though for me, it's not always just been about feedism. I think I've always had kind of a fascination with everything that's like bigger than I am, which is why I think I'm kind of like been predisposed. Like a lot of people switch between being a feeder and a feedee, or they do both, and that's totally fine. I always felt that for me, it was always having this contrast between me and a huge big guy, and that has been tall guys, muscular, but like never really like the bodybuilding kind of muscle. It's always been like more muscle chub, I guess, because it's just bigger in the end, I think. So I've I've been always a huge fan of Batman stuff because I've always associated with that just like someone really big. And now obviously I look back at what back then was like the George Clooney Batman, and there's nothing big about him, but it was
Uh,
like always kind of I was this small tiny little girl, and I looked up at everyone who was big and fat to some extent.
it's
Something
the
really fascinating, yeah.
referencing the Joel Schumacher version with the nipples on the bat suit,
Oh
right?
my god. I don't
Power.
even remember.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure, and this is some podcast cross promotion here. I'm sure you must enjoy the Kevin Smith podcast, Fat Man on Batman.
I have listened to a few episodes of that. I love the Comic Book Man, which is a really fun series in my opinion. But yeah, Kevin Smith is awesome in general. He's such a
Agreed.
cute guy.
Agreed.
And
And
by the way, just as a reference, he has worked on a documentary about the gay bear scene and even did a little speech, I think, at one of the smaller Comic Cons when it was released, and actually mentioned some of the chubby chaser scene and made a reference about how he thinks like, well, it doesn't exist in the straight community, and I'm like this close to sending him an email.
well, I think it's actually really good you mentioned that, because that's sort of a somewhat unique thing about fetism within the heterosexual community, is that the hetero community is light years behind the gay community in terms of getting our general shit together, and organized, because bear culture has been around for a very, very long time. I realized, I'm personally heterosexual, but I realized relatively early in life that
You're the
I
epitome of
express a lot
burnout.
of bear traits. Yeah,
Yeah.
no. So I'm relatively familiar. I live in South Florida. We have a fairly represented gay population, and some of my gay friends have informed me that I'm a bear, and a part of me has been like, yeah, I know, but believe me, I know way more. And certainly, even with it, even though some of the community sites that we both participate in have either know bent or are geared towards the straight community, I certainly get more than my fair share of messages from bears who are into it. Gentlemen, I'm flattered. We can talk, football or sports or whatever, but you're barking up the wrong tree. Um,
It's how I
either,
feel
either,
when FAs
yeah.
message me and for some reason don't want to talk about anything but myself, and I'm like, nope, sorry.
Yeah, certainly another thing. And I think we can save most of this topic for
Mhm.
another podcast, but certainly another thing where people who are basically just into the same umbrella kink um, send a message where thin male FAs send messages to, thin female FAs. And, on paper, this shouldn't work.
Yeah.
So it's a certainly interesting thing, but, I think it's also a very, typically something that's very private and very vulnerable. And in sharing that vulnerability with others through the
Mhm.
community, there might be an implied intimacy created by that, where people feel more comfortable to reach out than they would otherwise. And of course, the anonymity and relatively low stakes of the internet help that too.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
but that's interesting that you came to it through kind of just a uh, it seemed like a more like an evolving perspective from bigness to fatness to
Mhm.
every sort of bigness, versus something that was explicitly fat early on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love that you mentioned that because it kind of leads me into the second question immediately. And how did you first find the online community? Because for me, for example, as you just mentioned, the gay scene, as far as gaming is concerned, is way ahead of us also. Like if you just see Grammar, for example, just had its 5th-year anniversary. And Grammar is different than what we have had before because it is essentially part of what we probably consider Web 2.0, where we moved away from all the discussion boards, the Yahoo groups, and the IRC chats into something that was a lot more manageable, that had a news feed, that was sociable, that had a lot more interactions, searchable profiles, and things like that. We've seen the changes that the whole community has made, even just introducing Phoebe in this 1 year. It's been like a quantum leap to some extent, with pros and cons, obviously, but it's been a huge change. And Grummer's ahead 4 years, basically. And for me, for example, when I started finding the online community, I like so many people, or at least like so many other women, especially that I've talked to, their first introduction to it were actually the stories in the wait room of the Dimensions forums or the website back then. I don't think they actually even had the forum. But once I've gotten into the whole community, I've started noticing that most of it, if not all of it, depending on the website, was catered towards the BBW and Fat Admirers part of it. So I naturally kind of shifted towards the gay community to some extent just as a lurker because there was the only place where I could actually see big guys that would be celebrating their bodies. While in Dimensions or also on Fantasy Feeder, the most prevalent thing I always saw were big women, which is awesome. And it was about, they were talking about weight gain, and that definitely like hit a nerve with me, but it still lacked something, which is why I kind of switched over before Phoebe came along, for example, to what was like the Belly Builders forums. I had a like really low key lurker account on Grammar, and then obviously Tumblr came along, and that kind of solved all my problems until Phoebe came along.
Sure, and it's kind of interesting the different audiences that different platforms have been able to capture. I'm luckily as both a man and someone without any shame and a very wide open affinity for this stuff. I kind of just migrate to whatever the big site is of the day, pun completely intended. But how I found the community was back in the days of dial-up. I was actually looking for things online. I can't tell you what I typed into Dogpile or Ask Jeeves or Metacrawler or one of those good guys. um, but I was a very bad boy and did something that I don't recommend doing, which was back when I was in high school. Broke the rules that I am suggesting listeners of this podcast follow, and tried to find adult websites as a teenager. I found Dimensions, Dimensions magazine, which has been around in digital form basically as long as the commercial at-home internet has been. Since the early 90s, it's been online. That's provided kind of a clearinghouse function for fat issues, and also some fat eroticism. But they had, as you mentioned earlier, both a website subpage and then later a forum, the weight room and the weight board,
Mm.
which kind of served as the first hub for feederism, whatever we want to call
Mm.
it.
But which actually kind of sprung out from size acceptance at first, right? At least it's the understanding I always had of it.
Initially, I think there was Dimensions has a identity of fat acceptance, size acceptance, fat positivity as well, and sort of really a political identity in
Mm.
addition to just a a kink community or a sexual interest community. They brought attention to issues of size based discrimination and accommodation issues, um, and unfortunately for the kinkier members of the community, certain forces within the larger size acceptance community felt that there needed to be a
Separation between them
yeah,
and the fetishism community.
yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. I don't think that it was necessarily malicious or
Mm.
people having um, some sort of axe to grind or grudge against fetists. It was more it just didn't fit in with the direction that their conversation which was going, which is okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of gave rise to the first flourishing of alternative communities for fetusts on the internet. And I was lucky. I don't know. I mean certainly lucky compared to fetusts for the rest of history until now, where I guess you just stayed quiet about it. But I was lucky enough to be there and kind of experience, the those first communities launching, and certainly recaptured it with the launching of Phoebe and Fembrosia, and Fetus.net as well recently, where you get this just real sense of positivity and excitement whenever a new community launches.
Mm.
Uh, and you hope all your hopes and dreams this one's going to be different. And you play this for a while. Some of the issues in the community persist through different incarnations of different websites, but that might again be a topic for another podcast.
Yeah. To go a bit more personal, I know that you love food and you love cooking especially. You've cooked before as a career. You always said I shouldn't call you a chef, but
Well, I always thought chef was much too flattering. I was just slightly not good enough to be a chef. Most of the positions I've held in kitchens, I was either a lead line cook or a sous chef, and most of the time I got that job because I showed up. I just kept coming back to work. That in working in a professional kitchen, that's a
you mean
good
the same
thing.
way a stalker gets to be a boyfriend one day? That's not what it sounded like. I was just there.
It happens.
No,
It happens.
no, you
No, but
deserve credit for that.
no, no, that, but yeah, no, I've always found the closest I'm ever able to come to something resembling artistic expression has been cooking. It's
Mm.
peaceful and meditative for me. It's also, instant gratification for me. I make something, someone eats it, they tell me it's good.
Or you
There's
eat it.
or ha ha ha. Yeah, no, but I also love food. I love good food. One of my favorite ways to, understand a new city, is to eat my way through it. And try and stay up on both national and local trends on like what's going on in food. Um, I'm not sure because I have plenty of friends who are vanilla and not fat kinky and not fetusts who are similarly inclined to pay attention to goings on in the food and restaurant world. I'm not sure if my uh, kink proclivities play a role in that, but certainly interesting to think about.
Which is an interesting point because there's always this romanticized or even fetishized idea in the kink community when it comes to most of the jobs that revolve around food, like from the secret perving fantasies for feeders or like the secret and like overindulgence fantasies for feedies. And I think most people realize a lot of that isn't like it's not founded in reality to some extent, considering catering and like all the gastronomy jobs are some of the most stressful jobs out there. But How was it the experience for you? Like, is there at least like some kind of secret perving or satisfaction from doing that?
I think that's true. I think that's true. I've certainly never experienced it personally that I've been able to take a shift at the restaurant and derive, some sort of gratification from it that scratched the kink itch. Usually because, again, cooking is manual labor. You're on your
Mm.
feet all, you're aching afterwards. Usually you just want to either collapse or take a shower. So there's kind of an inconvenient confluence sometimes of going out to eat for a restaurant and being a fat man myself. If a server says you ready for dessert, there's a part of me that's wondering, oh my goodness, do they know? Do they know? And then there's a part of me that also just thinks like, hey, they want to pad the bill so they get a better tip. It's a day at the office for them. So who knows? I really can't say one way or the other as to it. It certainly has helped. Knowing how to cook a lot of food relatively well, very fast, doesn't hurt you in this community. And I know some of the people with whom I've interacted over the years have expressed um, a degree of attraction to the fact that I did used to cook professionally. I always like talking to um, other cooks who are fetus within the scene, just because not only is it kind of fun to talk shop with people from that very specific world. It's very rare to get people from two very specific worlds to talk about things. So it's just interesting to get their takes on things.
Yeah, I've read some of those conversations on Phoebe, and I've always been baffled by the amount of detail you guys go into. It's fascinating. And I've toyed with the idea myself because I have this romanticized version of it, and I just know it's not gonna hold up. And I'm gonna stay a psychologist, I think. But I've still it's a great hobby of mine, and I think it is for a lot of people in the community.
Yeah, yeah. I've yet to meet in my own personal life as someone who and this is certainly not me bragging, but as someone who like I'm fat. I'm not chunky or chubby or pudgy or husky or any of those euphemisms that
Yeah.
people like to use. I'm significantly beyond that point where if you call me anything other than fat, you're not accurately describing me. And as a result, the people who I've dated, I'm pretty okay with being fat most of the time, and I don't ever really get into it with someone who is not into fat guys.
Mm.
Um, and kind of to a person, they've all had some serious ability to cook or some serious love of food on their own where they we could always relate. I never was going to be worried about going out to eat and just having someone want to eat a salad or going out or they always had a
Mm.
cookie recipe they wanted to try, things like that.
Yeah.
So it certainly doesn't help, or it doesn't hurt rather.
Because it's
It's
more than
it's
just like a kink that you do in bed. It's to some extent it's a mindset.
Yeah, and that's probably another. Good God, so many topics. That's probably another topic
Yeah.
we'll get into sometime later in the podcast series. It really is the kink you don't take off.
Hmm.
And people are also going to make pretty wide ranging assumptions if you either are fat or if you like fat people about who you are, what you want out of life, how you treat your partner.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think that brings up an interesting divide in the community of people who for them this kink is confined exclusively to the online realm,
Mm.
uh, and people come up with all sorts of justifications for it, and then people who kind of cross over and make the jump. And that's actually, I think that's a good place for me to. I'm looking at the questions you sent over because you're ever so prepared in that powerfully German way of yours.
I'm not
Swiss,
German.
Swiss German. Pardon me. You're German enough. I'm American. I don't understand your accent. Luxembourgish. Um, but one of the things you asked was how's the kink evolved over time? Because
Yeah.
I told you when we were going over our introductions, I kind of consider myself an all-around fetus, and it wasn't the case when I approached the community that I thought to myself like, "Hey everyone, I'm a complete freak show. Let's party." Instead, it was a process for me
Mm.
of um,
Like it is for many people.
yeah, and everyone has their own process, and then and what worked for me, I'll be very clear. What worked for me is not by any means representative of the path everyone takes or the speed everyone gets there. I at this point have basically been aware and connected to some aspect of the internet fetus kink community for more of my life than I haven't. I'm talking 15 plus years now, so it's not the type of thing that I got to recently, but the my approach to the community was as a feeder, was very much like you. And I think for me, in part, not only was it the appeal of feeding itself, which I thought and still think is really hot, and
Mm.
kind of my fat admiration, which is tied to that. But I thought for myself at the time, um, kind of not be, the fear, I guess, that some feedies have is that they're going to get involved with this in real life, find out that they don't like it, and, be 50, 75, 100 pounds heavier, and, kind of forced to diet and correct this mistake of theirs. And by the time I kind of gave into it and started dipping my toes into the feedy side of things, I guess that was sort of I was able to resolve those fears and just realize that all of this kink is hot for me. And also, you kind of develop a more nuanced appreciation of what it means.
Mm.
And I'd recommend anyone who hasn't to go and look at HORNGRY #1, which we'll provide a link to. There's a great infographic which discusses the different types of fetus. Cheap plug. But this, but you also kind of realize that feedism, being a feedie, doesn't mean uh, you know ending up completely immobile, and being a feeder doesn't mean cramming your partner full of food every moment of every day until they can't walk.
Yeah.
It's a very nuanced thing, and feedism can happen with or without gaining. Gaining can happen with or without feedism. Nature too.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
the same way as when you look at every other kink, like if you're into BDSM and you want to be a sub, it doesn't mean that you jump in and you're immediately gonna be in your first BDSM relationship, you're gonna be like a 24/7 slave that's gonna be locked in the basement or something like that. It's just not like that. There's many varieties and nuances to that and ways and how you can incorporate if you want to incorporate it into your everyday life.
I think that's really true, and I think part of that is my impression of the people who actually end up taking the plunge and exploring it in their real life. It's a relatively low percentage of the the internet community, and kind of when you're online and you don't have the not only the constraints but sort of just the perspective that living these things out in real life gives you. Um, People tend to go to the extreme.
Mm.
Feedism has not been done many favors by mainstream culture. We're usually perceived as the first reaction is disbelief, and the second one is laughter, and then the third is like horror.
Yeah.
So usually in my experience, from having been in real life fetus relationships myself and having friends in the community who I've known for over a decade who have been in similar real life fetus relationships, the reality is usually much more tame and much more bland, and very few people ever end up in some sort of thing that would be the feedist version of your 24/7 lifestyle BDSM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's at the end of the day, it's like any other relationship, and it's part of what turns you on. Just as even if you're in a completely vanilla relationship, it's not all gonna be about sex all the time. You're gonna have your normal everyday things and responsibilities and things you do. And kink is just your way of expressing your sexuality in that aspect.
As cute and innocuous as we've just made it seem, I think you brought up a great point in one of the questions you sent over, which is, okay, so we've talked about how wonderful and sweet and fun and non-threatening it is, but have you ever come out to a civilian about it? And I can answer first on this. I don't know if you have a story.
I do have, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll tell you mine first because I feel like you probably told more people
Yeah, probably.
what with publishing this magazine and all.
I actually had it
But
in the YouTube series, Kinky Gaming, where I talked about it.
ah,
Hmm.
yes. TenderLovingCares hosts she's a woman of many talents. She hosts yet another podcast because
It's not a podcast. It's
oh, I don't know. She doesn't sleep. She runs on, I don't know, kittens.
kittens and
Um,
coffee. Yeah, that's me.
mainly, yeah. Just completely does a ton of stuff. But no, I relatively recently had an experience where I ended up talking with a friend of mine, who is sort of, who fancies themselves kind of an out there, uh, radical, sex positive, kink positive person. And my presentation to the general public is, it's just like any relationship based thing or kink. I don't walk around with a sign that says "Ask me about like getting off to fat people." So she had mentioned that she wanted to try something kink related. I mean, apropos of nothing, this came up over brunch. I think once. So some completely bullshit thing where she just wanted to tell me, look at the weird thing I'm doing now. And I thought,
And you thought, how
this
cute.
yeah, I remember my first beer. No, I thought, this feels right. And so I said, I'm kind of involved in like an internet community for this stuff too. And she wanted to know more about it, and immediately she was like, "Oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it." And I
Wait,
told her,
but
and
when she mentioned she wants to do something kinky, she wasn't specifically talking about like
no, not
fetishism, right?
attacking.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, in fact, I think that's worth clarifying too. When I said kink, she thought BDSM,
Yeah.
because that's the definition of kink for a lot of people.
Mm.
Um, and so when I kind of explained in greater detail, how I get my jollies, uh, you know, she was about as good a first time reactor as you could be. I thought it was pretty pretty game of her to smile and nod and then never bring it up again.
Like the 5 stages
So
of what the fuck.
no. Yeah. We're still friends. We've hung out since. There's nothing crazy, but it's as someone who as both of us are people who have access to a community where we have friends who are into this, and people who we kind of keep up on and stay in touch with, and this sort of social circle almost that we participate in who are all kinky. It is kind of easy for me to lose sight sometimes because I think this is just such a fun and sweet and natural, and like I think it's actually kind of like a cute fetish. Like it's just it's like it's adorable.
Yeah.
Oh, baking and cooking and food and tummies and cuddling. Like it can be very sweet.
Mm. It can be very
But
hardcore though as well, which
it,
is what I find fascinating about the king.
it's completely wide open.
Mm.
And it can be. But I forget sometimes how bizarre it is to people who aren't kind of indoctrinated into the circle. they
Yep,
still look at you when you talk to them about this like you've just grown like a third eye in the middle of your forehead.
definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
so that
And
was
I have
my
that same feeling when it comes to like with all the stuff I do with the magazine and I'm on Phoebe and I'm a mod on Fambrosia and this podcast and then like my art is kink related. Sometimes I feel like I'm kind of losing touch with what other people compare like consider normal, and I just blurt out things, which is probably like the main reason why all of my friends know about it, because they've just gotten used to me blurting out weird random inappropriate things about fat people in public. I mean, not to them,
whoops.
but
Yeah.
I don't know, if I think a guy's hot, I'm gonna say he's like, as girlfriends, it's like I'm never been like that girly girl like with the clicks and everything, but I do have like one very close friend, and like the main reason I kind of got her roped into this whole kink thing to the point where she actually has a profile on Phoebe was that when we talked about hot guys or we saw someone that we thought was cute while we were, I don't know, on university campus or something like that, I'm I'm just gonna be me, and if I see a hot fat guy, I'm gonna say, "Look, he's really cute." And at first, it was probably really weird for her for me to point out like a really really fat guy and say that he's cute, but she got used to it, and then to some point, she found it endearing, and it kind of crossed over, and that's how it works for like for most things. People who are into my art will probably have started noticing like I have an art page on Facebook where most of my friends, even some family members, follow that page where I've just recently started uploading some kink art every now and again, and I think now they know.
Yikes.
Well, it's never been like completely not safe for work, but for example, the cover of the third issue of Hungry I've uploaded, or just having art where you have skinny people, but you also have chubby people, because that's just kind of what bodies look like. They're not all skinny and slender or toned.
That's very true. That's very true. Yeah, I think also, once you make the commitment to live out a part of this kink, if you maintain the same group of friends over a while, they figure it out. You date date enough of a certain body type one after the other,
Yeah.
and yeah, it kind of becomes a little bit more obvious. Or you get in a relationship and gain weight to go, whatever
Mm.
happens, but they
But there's
can.
also a difference
Eh,
like between the fetishism aspect of it and just the preference aspect of it. Like, well, I'm not gonna run up to someone and actually go like into detail like what I like to do, like as far as like actual fetishisms go, like I don't know, hand feeding or spoon feeding or like belly play. I don't really go into that. But I'm not gonna hide that I'm attracted to bigger people. For me that's just, it's not even who I am, but to some extent I also feel there's some obligation, because when I date bigger people, my friends, my family, they will not only notice that, but they will be confronted with a lot of their own stereotypes when it comes to fat people. Like I've had an issue with my mom that she would like one day, or she hinted it for a bit, and then one day like kind of she straight out said like, "Why do you keep settling for those big guys?" And she meant it like wholeheartedly as something like really nice, and like telling me that, oh, she thinks I mean, I've always been like her princess, and like I have an awesome mom. So she meant it in such an endearing way, but she just assumed that I was settling for big guys instead of going for what I'm really into, which was what she considered to be beautiful. And I actually had to tell her, no, I actually like bigger guys. I think that's cuter. If I would just date skinny guys, that might be settling. If you even really wanted to just define it by looks, which I don't think is fair, because if I'm into someone, the size comes second. I mean, there are some things I don't really want to compromise on, but less it's even less the size, it's more like the fetishism mindset, for example, like you said with some of your ex-girlfriends, for example. So I think
yeah,
I feel at least some obligation when it concerns the person I'm going to be dating to be open about the fact that that's what I desire, so that they don't have to deal with all the backlash once I actually start dating them.
I think you raise a really good point though, because fat bodies are not in vogue. They are not the societal beauty standard. Um, and either dating one or being one kind of comes with a certain amount of baggage that you have to either
Either
learn to deal
ignore,
with or
yeah,
tune out, or whatever the case may be.
or confront
And I
it.
know. and or confront it. And I know personally from our talks previous, you've dated bodybuilder, you've
Mhm.
dated fat guys,
Yep.
you've been all over the spectrum. I've dated partners who are 200 pounds lighter than me. I've dated partners who are 100 pounds lighter, never quite my size. I'm pretty big. Um, I've dated women who society would call fat and women who society would call thin.
Mhm.
And it's been a eye-opening experience for me because no one would ever question a fat man dating a fat woman. In
Yeah.
fact, this is what is supposed to happen. Uh, and I felt particularly bad for women in the past who are more conventionally. I don't even qualify it and say conventionally. I usually just luck out. Women who are more attractive than me, period.
Oh.
Um, get questioned about their preference and say, you like your boyfriend in spite of the way he looks, and it's a rough thing to understand. You're just going to get so much judgment for saying that you like someone because of the way they look.
Mm.
So it's a weird kink, and it's something that I think would be difficult for a lot of people to say, would you still be into your thing if you had to be public about it, or at least more public than you can be when you put away the gimp costume or the furry suit, or whatever floats your boat. Um, the bottom line is the lived experience of fat kink, even if in its most vanilla form of just dating a fat person,
Mm.
uh, is almost transgressive in society because it breaks a rule about what looks good. So it's not easy to be, not easy to do, but I think I know for me, I don't have a choice. It's just part of who I am, and I'm unable to not think this way. I certainly have moments where I've thrown up my hands and tried to walk away from the community and say, ugh, I'm done with these people for whatever reason. And
Have you tried?
I once or twice over the past 15 years, I just, I said, this is, and part of it was very, very little of it was related to the kink itself. It was more related to people in the scene.
Okay, yeah.
Um, but,
Because there are a lot
whatever.
of people who actually struggle with the kink itself and kind
Sure.
of,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's, no, that's
Mm.
true too. And there's and again, probably for a later podcast. I know we've mentioned it before, maybe like in Tiny Chat or something. Um, Shout out to the Phoebe unofficial Tiny Chat. Tiny Chat. Uh, you know, for one reason or another, it anecdotally seems like there's a higher incidence of people who are struggling with disordered eating or in
Mm.
eating disorder recovery within the fetus community in general. And we could speculate till the cows come home about why this happens, but Lord knows that if you're open about your preference here, you're going to get some pushback, and it's going to come from all aspects of society. It will come from
Mm.
mass culture. It will come from the people you love. It will come from people who are genuinely concerned about you, who
Yep.
think the way you're thinking is wrong, or the way you're living is wrong, or the way you look is wrong, or I've heard stories of feeders being accused of abuse
Mm.
because they consensually feed their feedies. I've heard stories about feedies having a death wish. And nothing could be further from the truth. I think at its heart, feedism is a celebration of love. It's a celebration of life. It's something that people do positively,
Yeah.
and affirmatively. It's not this. It's not, well, I tried normal dating and it didn't work, so now I'll try kinky stuff. No, in fact, it's it's a pain in the ass because we lose the vast majority of people in the world. When we admit to ourselves we're not going to settle for anything but that which it is that we truly desire.
Mm.
So I think a lot of the concerns that people have come from a lack of understanding. I think one of the things that goes unsaid in uh, kind of the fetus community is also probably the fact that we spend a lot of time talking about how society views things and all these other there's society this and culture that and the unspoken thing here is we're usually talking about American culture and American society. And we're doing that in such a way that even though some of our web portals, Phoebe included, will translate their entire site into 20 or 30 languages now. It's actually pretty impressive.
It is.
Or provide automatic metric imperial conversions. Most of what we talk about, it's almost impossible, and this kind of just talks about how far reaching the kink is. It's almost impossible for, I think, someone who is not from America to not develop a sense for American culture through the majority of fetus kink content creation out there, because we talk about American restaurants and American food products and American nutritional schemes and and pounds and ounces and inches and
and on the other hand, you have a bunch of Europeans like us just reading about all your Oreo flavors and stuff like that and just salivating over the idea
sure.
of it.
Yeah, it's bizarre to me just because I don't want to live in a world where cinnamon roll Oreos don't exist, and so the fact that I mean, I guess you have Kinder eggs, and we can't get those, but that's about it.
But they're not a comparison. They're whatever.
I mean, we can buy handguns, but our kids might choke on the Kinder eggs. All right, this is not a political thing. All right. Anyhow, that's something I did want to bring up, because even though you are a native Hawaiian, which is a bizarre thing to say, you spent most of your time growing up in Switzerland, and that's kind of, and I know you're in Luxembourg now, and that kind of provides a.
I've been almost as long in Luxembourg now that I've actually been in Switzerland when I was a kid, so it's kind of starting to even out, I guess.
So you're just moving to places that Americans are increasingly less likely to recognize. As I doubt most of us could find Switzerland on a map. I think very few of us can find Luxembourg. Just know it's patents buried there. Yeah, the experience of non-American feeders, and I know you can't, or fetusts rather, and I know you can't speak for all non-American fetusts. I have to assume is different. I know you speak English fluently, but every time, every so often I'll browse Phoebe and I'll see a post that's written in a non-English language, and most of the time it'll either be completely ignored or someone might respond to it in the language it was posted, or an English-speaking Phoebe user will be like, "What the hell, man? Speak English."
Sometimes.
Sometimes, which is bizarre because the internet, if nothing else, distance doesn't matter. This is a podcast that's being recorded simultaneously in Miami, Florida, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. So it's difficult to assume that that the fetus community is inherently American, even though majority of its users are. And I wanted to ask you if you had kind of any insights for what I assume most of the podcast listening audience will be also American, but the different experience of not only having this kink in, as a European versus an American, but also realizing that the kink community itself is American and navigating that as well. It would be bizarre to me to think, let's say that I'm into BDSM, but I can only browse Japanese BDSM sites. I don't get it. So I'm interested on your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some differences that I noticed. I mean, even before Phoebe, you had mainly some difference just down to the fact that we used to use different sites. I mean, there were, and since I've learned English when I was, I think, like 12 or 13, So I've never been that much into all the German side, but still are big discussion boards out there that are just like, for example, for German users or for French users or for Spanish users. So there's definitely, I think, something about those being kind of closed communities for a long time that made them develop into a different direction. But I'm always interested in seeing how cultural things influence the way you think about the kink, or what's more like the most enticing aspect of the kink for you. And I have this theory, and I have no way of telling if it's really accurate. So, like, if anyone's listening and they can relate to that, or they have made completely different experiences, I'd love to hear about them. You can, we'll plug all the links and how to contact us, and you can always comment in the comments and stuff like that. Just let us know what your experience is. But what I've experienced a lot is, if you look for example, like it's Central European culture, there's a huge thing about what sports, for example, are important to the culture, such as soccer, while you Americans have American football. And if anyone's seen how a football team looks compared to what a soccer team looks like, there's a huge size disparity in that.
Sure. Yeah.
And you can also see it in how many European countries, and it's definitely changing, but for a long time there used to be a higher prevalence of chubby to fat people in the States than here in Europe. I think it's pretty much evening out by now, especially as far as statistics go in Germany. I know the Germans are catching up to you Americans for sure, but there's definitely always been this thing that it's less common in many Central European countries or Scandinavian countries to be fat. And
Yeah.
I do see some sort of trend that it being more taboo here than it might be in the States, where you see it just on a more common basis, or you're confronted to it on TV with football, which doesn't have such negative connotation. It's something you grew up on, and a lot of people admire, like the big tight ends or the defensive lines. It's something many kids aspire to becoming one day. So it's not as taboo to just like even be husky, for example, like many people would put it, as compared to here, where it's a lot more uncommon. That I have personally made the experience that a lot more European people who are into feedism see it automatically as this: if you're a feedy, you're into teasing and humiliation, and you're a lot more sub. And it sounds like a huge generalization, and I know there are people who fall outside of that, and I do, because I actually prefer more dominant guys when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
feeding. And so it's always been weird to me that so many people, and like all the message boards I've joined that have been more European, a lot of them don't question that there's another way of going about within feedism. And I think that's one of the awesome things about like the bigger sites that we have now, that people are kind of confronted with, oh, you can also be a feeding, and you can be like a dominant guy,
Yeah.
and or a dominant woman, and that is awesome. But I do think that like in everything, culture shapes us. They shape the way we think about it, and it definitely shapes the way we approach the kink.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things about, and I'll just mention this briefly, the American perception of fat versus my experience of some other European or non-American fat people, is that although we have many more fat people than I guess the rest of the field, if you look at the world, um, we don't talk about it. It's not uncommon, here in Miami, for someone who comes from a Latin American country or overseas, if they're fat, to have the nickname of Gordo. You would
Mm-hmm.
never, ever, which is fat in Spanish, you would never, ever have an American person, if they were fat, have the nickname of Fatty. It just
Yeah.
it wouldn't happen. So we don't talk about it. I don't know if it's talked about more or less, but it's a surprising thing for me. Um, because I still routinely have people insist that I am not fat. Oh, you're just a big guy. It's like, nah. I
You're
mean,
big
you're
boned.
right. Yeah, it's not all bones are really soft, and they're mainly located in my stomach, but it's just full of bones. No, it's weird, sort of the way we deal with it, and I think you're right in kind of how these things shape us. And I think it's actually been a very net positive that the internet has been there to help us escape our local culture, because I think that historic uh, concept about how feedism had to work, that feedies had to be submissive, feeders had to be dominant,
Yeah.
feedies had to be women, and feeders had to be men. I think that's breaking down rapidly, and even breaking down in the nomenclature. The kink used to be referred to as feederism,
Yep.
and it's now increasingly and more popularly. And for the sake of our podcast, I think we're always going to refer to it as feedism because it does a better job of conveying the lack of presumption in those relationships, and that the
Yep.
agency can belong to both parties, and it can, it's general fat kink stuff with the feeding twist, but it's not, it's certainly not always the case that the feeder is the active part, is the subject of the feeding experience, and the feedee is the object, and
Mm-hmm.
that's it.
Yeah,
So I think,
even down to some other aspects, like for example, feedism doesn't always have to include weight gain. It can also just be about food, like the whole bloating and inflation, even, or stuffing aspect of it. I mean, those are very well represented aspects within our kink community. Same way goes, for example, you can be a feedie even though you're not fat yet, for example, or you never really want to
yeah,
be fat, for example. That's
that's
yeah.
very true, and I think we're probably following the lead of the gay community there as well, in terms of creating those different identities
Mhm.
rather than the classic. So
Yeah.
once again,
Which
thank you, bears, you did it again. And of course, not all bears are into it, but
no. Um,
it seems like those who are into it tend to be bears. Uh,
well, there's all kinds
whatever.
of like
Sure.
of the gay subcultures that can be into it, whether they are looking gay or bulls
That's
or jubs. I mean, jubs and chasers would be what our straight equivalent would be, just the BBWs and PHMs and the FAs and FFAs, meaning that it doesn't
yeah.
have to include feudalism, even though it can. But I love that you mentioned that, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the fat fetish flag that we actually have, because that is something that I haven't yet been able to cover in the first three issues of. Now I start saying episodes in the first three
Yeah.
issues of Hungry, and in the fact that we do have a kink pride flag, so to speak, for fat fetishism as a whole that was born out of the gay community.
What
So
are we calling it? It's the adipophilia
yeah, exactly. It's the
flag.
adipophilia flag
Yeah.
or fat fetish flag, and it was created by. I'm still gonna pronounce it French. It's gonna be Kevin Seguin. You say it's Seguin? I don't know.
I don't know.
He's
Neither
no,
of us know Kevin, so
he's known as the Cosmopolitan, and I was barely able to find more about him than that. I'm gonna try to track down more for maybe a later segment in one of the magazines. But he
well, it's
came up.
interesting. It's
Yeah,
interesting that he's known as the Cosmopolitan because the colors of the flag are the Neapolitan.
Neapolitan, exactly. It's an
Yeah,
amazing flag. So for people who haven't seen it, it's a flag with 5 stripes on it. The bottom and the top stripes are black, and the 3 in the middle are the ones that you might, hopefully, if you're a pianist, be familiar as the Neapolitan ice cream colors. So you've got strawberry pink, you've got vanilla, like what would be like a
ivory or
beige or
cream. Yeah.
yeah, cream, and the chocolatey brown, and there's a heart in the middle that overlaps those 3. So
Oh,
I found a little bit that he actually wrote about that flag that I found really interesting, and that kind of sums up a lot of the things we've been talking about. And he specifically says that fat fetishism is like a broad spectrum that includes many different interrelated fetishes. At its most basic level, fat fetishism is an appreciation of size, expansion, adipose, or food-related sensations, either in the individual, the partner, or both. Though it is often described as a spectrum, such linear thinking is most often a simplification of a very fluid and dynamic group of fetishes that are not always as narrow as outsiders may want to characterize them. Although some people have very few specific fetishes, it is not uncommon for people in this group to be interested in multiple avenues of pleasure. So how he breaks it down, the 3 colors, well, the 4 colors if you count in the black and then the heart at the end, he has, first of all, the amazing idea of just having it be ice cream flavors. I mean, there's nothing that could be more like the epitome of fat fetishism, I think, than ice cream colors. The vanilla, the cream color, represents the fat and belly worship aspect of it, which doesn't have to include fetism. the strawberry is representing the fat role play part of it. By extension, one of the most diverse, like inflation, bloating, stuffing, padding, and even war. And the chocolate one is what he calls the part that should represent weight gain, encouragement, and feederism. So he phrases it really, really amazing. Chocolate can be understood as a very visceral flavor that is focused more on the results of gluttony and the weight it confers on an individual or a group of individuals, even two sexual partners, which I found really beautiful thing. So then here, of course, you have the black stripes that are something that might be a bit more common in the gay community from what I've seen online, because it crosses over to some like of the bear and the daddy things. But it represents other fetishes in general. He lists BDSM and leather, but if he specifies that it can be any fetish, it could literally be anything. And the heart in the middle, as you've mentioned so beautifully before, just means that in the end, it's all about love and affection. And
Yeah.
yeah,
I think it's a fantastic flag myself.
yes, I
And
love it.
I'm much less bothered by the the black stripes representing BDSM, because this type of identity flag clearly owes a great deal of kind of trailblazing forbearance to the original pride flag, the rainbow flag.
Yes.
And all kind of the
letter pride flag.
Yeah, and then the divergent flags thereafter that were spawned. So
and it also, I mean, we can't
I
deny that there is some aspect of our kink that for a lot of people is inherently about the sub-dom community, even if it's to like a lesser extent. And I think it's not as accurate, like it's more accurate in mainstream idea of what fetism is, but you still see it represented to a big extent. Like if there's one other kink that I would most associate with fetism, it would be the BDSM thing.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And I think that it's at the end of the day, it's also just a flag,
Yeah.
and it's up to the members of the community to make it stand for the things we want it to. But I think as just not only kind of a visual pun of the ice cream colors, and then just also kind of the aesthetics of the flag, I'm glad to have it. I don't think we need to
Yes.
make up a million different names, so I don't need to start calling myself an Adipophile or anything like that.
No.
But you can call me it. I don't care, whatever. But
It's also nice that he doesn't really just he doesn't. I found it interesting that he, for example, he has the whole like role playing thing, like stuffing and bloating, completely separated from fetism, which I thought were more like a part of fetism, for example. But I like that it's like way more fluid than that. He doesn't. He specifically says it's not just a spectrum, but it's just, well, some other kinks will totally overlap, and then at other times they might not. Like we have so many diversities, like even furries and war that he mentions that you couldn't, like if you're a foot fetish, there's, I always feel like there's way more limit to what other kinks you might associate with that as compared to fat.
And I think that's the real point there. It's a big tent. It's
Yeah.
a really, really wide net that is cast by this, because at the end of the day, it's something as simple and as tied to everyone's life by virtue of simple biological survival as eating. We all do it. Everyone does it. We're certainly lucky in that our kink is not so particularly niche or
like quicksand.
difficult. But, yeah, good God, you've got to probably travel the world to find quicksand. And no offense to quicksand fetishists out there.
It's fascinating, but yeah.
Yeah. But it's something that everyone deals with every day, and it's and in that regard, I'm actually thankful that that's what does it for me, because I don't really believe I chose fetism. I don't. I think we have a certain amount of agency in what aspects of our underlying sexual identity we emphasize or de-emphasize, but it's pretty easy compared to the other stuff. I just go to the fridge and figure something out versus having to go find out, search where quicksand still is. So
we have a very convenient kink, definitely.
Yeah, definitely, and I'm glad we have a flag that kind of represents how broad things can get too. So I know we're almost out of time. And you gave me, with your psychology background, a heck of a last question. because I don't have a great answer to it, but I do want to try and answer it, which is what
Okay, wait, but
importance.
can I set it up? Because there's something I wanted to
Oh, please.
mention when it comes to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because
All right.
okay, so as I said, I'm a psychologist. Maybe I totally overthink this thing, but I've had a bunch of interviews for the last 3 issues of Hungry. But there's one question that's always interested me, and that is, what importance does kink have in your life? Because for me, I do give it a lot of importance, just because we've said it's more than just what I do when I'm horny and with someone. It's something I think about when I'm alone. It's something that shapes who I'm attracted to, or sometimes what stuff I watch on TV, or what I pay attention to, or it's a mindset. It's how I feel about food. It's about how I feel about beauty standards, because it makes me question those things. And I've always been really surprised at how so far pretty much every single person has kind of had this very knee-jerk reaction of, oh, well, it's just a kink. It's like it doesn't have a big importance. And I found that mind-boggling for me. So I'm gonna keep asking the question, because I want to see if that's really just me who thinks about it so differently or not. Because I doubt it. I just think it might be kind of just this instinctive reaction that people don't want to give sex the importance that it actually has, because I think sex is hugely important to how we live our daily lives, even outside of the actual sexual encounter. And by by definition, that includes kinks for us. But I do know that a lot of people, just how society even works, kind of try to de-emphasize the importance it has, and kind of has this idea of, oh, love is so much more important than sex, even though for me it's like almost the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's an interesting take on it, and I think I think I have probably something relatively similar. Um, in terms of what role or the amount of importance it plays in my life, I think the thing that I can say is, as I get older, as I spend more time with it, it's an increasing amount. It's something that probably when I first approached it, I didn't have a lot of desire to integrate it. I always knew it was a part of me. I always knew that it was natural. I didn't need to talk myself into it,
Mm,
or explain to myself why I was interested in this. But after finding the communities, it is both. There's 100% a sexual dynamic to it, and I think your point is well taken. That let's not forget about that. Um, but I can speak to it as a fat man as one of the few places where I'm also allowed to just be unapologetically fat
yes.
and not get not get exercise advice from total strangers or diet tips, or have people, or just talk about having a really big meal with a really big dessert because I enjoyed having a really big meal with a really big dessert,
Mm,
and not having the possibility of people judging me harshly, or telling me they're concerned for me or something so it's just there's that, which is an incredibly refreshing thing, and I certainly can understand the appeal of a place like the internet feedist community, for just fat people in general, because so few of those spaces where people can be unapologetically fat exist.
mm,
For me, it's also a place where I've met several friends who I've known for over a decade, and talked to, and most of the time we just bullshit. But sometimes, sometimes we talk about the thing that we can't talk about with our other friends, or that we don't always
yeah.
talk about with our other friends, which is kink stuff. And most, for the most part, we've never met each other. We're just internet friends, and you can kind of be a little bit more bold about what you want to say without you're not going to have to like see this person at someone's baptism later or something. You can just be all weird and talk about your furtive fetus longing versus versus having real world consequences. But I think it it kind of shapes my outlook on a lot of other things, because in order to accept fetism as natural and a positive thing, you have to reject a lot of kind of things that we axiomatically accept in society, specifically that fat is bad.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to do that, then you're willing to kind of second guess a lot of the assumptions that we make in society. And I think I don't want to, I really dislike when people attempt to use Feedism to toot their own horn and say, oh, I have a Renaissance era appreciation of beauty.
Yeah.
But it's like, I like Rubenesque women. It's always Rubenesque women. It's like, anytime anyone's brought that up, I've said, name one painting by Peter Paul Rubens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
no one has ever done that.
But to be fair,
Um,
I mean, we
yeah,
know how hard it can be. So I
sure.
always am like, whatever makes it feel better, whatever, like, people end there after a thought process, and for some people it's easier, and for some people it's harder to actually get around the fact that there are fetists. I mean, there are
Well,
skinny guys who want to gain weight who are really conflicted by it. I've actually read a very interesting Tumblr of a Christian guy who was very, very conflicted about the thought of like gluttony being a sin, So we all have our different paths to kind of go until we reach a point. And not all of us have to even reach the point. It's an open path. It doesn't really have a destination, but it's just how you live with how you identify yourself, and
mhm.
whatever works. But yeah, I do sometimes
you,
smirk
you,
a little when I read that kind of stuff.
you're also a much nicer person than I am, and I'm a miserable old bastard. So that's that's just the way it works. And we might have to agree to disagree on that one to a certain extent. But no, I think we should. The last thing I'd want to say is that it's 100% a journey, and however you get there, you get there.
Yep.
There's no right or wrong way to be a fetist, in my opinion, as long as you stay in your lane and you don't tell other people how to do it either.
So this was our very first episode, and we really hope you enjoyed it. We're still kind of figuring out some technical stuff that will improve over the next few episodes. But if you have any suggestions for topics for future episodes, if you want to give us some feedback, leave comments, or if you actually want to be a guest for our podcast, just leave us a comment. I'm going to be posting all the links in the description below. Or you can just email me directly at hongrymagazine@gmail.com. I also wanted to personally thank One Deadly Sin. He's the awesome musician and fellow community member who made our amazing new intro. Please everyone go check out his gaming Tumblr, it's gamingstraight.tumblr.com. And if you want to hear more of his music, just go check out his SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/MikeAshleyMusic. If you want to contact Patrick, you can find him on Phoebe or for Ambrosia as PizzaWolf, and you can find me on those same platforms as TenderLovingCares. There's more info about the magazine, about the podcast, and all the other projects on HORNGRYmagazine.com or on my Tumblr at tenderlovingcares.tumblr.com. If you really like this episode and you would like to support me in creating content for the Feedism community, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/HORNGRY, where you can even get some special rewards and extra content for supporting HORNGRY. I'm also working really hard on issue number 4 of the magazine, and that should be coming out in just a few weeks, so definitely be on the lookout for that. I'm gonna be posting a bunch of updates about that. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
I'm hungry. I'm so hungry.